The check landed face up on the green baize, $100,000 written out in a careless, slanting hand, and Roman Vance smiled the way certain men smile when they have never once in their whole lives been told no. He had just taken apart 3 of his own vice presidents at the chessboard, one after another, none of them lasting 10 minutes, and the easy wins had only sharpened his appetite. He wanted the rest of it now. He wanted the audience, the silence, the small cruelty of watching a room full of people understand that he was better than they were and always would be. What none of them expected. Not Vance, not the executives loosening their collars over $40 scotch, not the maitre hovering by the service door with the strained smile of a man whose job depended on this night going smoothly, was that the answer would come from the woman refilling the water glasses. She set her tray down on the sideboard. She dried her hands on the front of her apron, and she said, in a voice that didn't need to be loud because the room had already gone quiet enough to hear it, that she would take the bet. It was the 2nd Tuesday of January, and Toronto was doing what Toronto did in January, which was press down on the city with a grey cold that got into the joints and stayed there. Outside the windows of the Halcyon Room, the private salon on the top floor of the Carlisle Hotel in Yorkville, the one with the long view of the lit-up towers along Bay Street. The wind came off the lake and rattled the old glass in its frames. Inside, none of that reached them. Inside, there were orchids on every table, and a fire that ran on gas but looked like the real thing, and the kind of warmth that money buys, so it never has to think about the cold again. The men of Vance Holdings had a great deal to celebrate. That afternoon, the city's Committee of Adjustment had handed them the last approval they needed for the Junction development, which was the polite name for tearing down 4 square blocks of low-rise rental housing near Dundas West and putting up glass towers nobody who currently lived there could afford. 240 units of the old kind, gone. Families who had been in those apartments for 30 years. Given their notice in a form letter. The men in this room had made the numbers work, and the numbers were beautiful, and so they drank to themselves and to Roman Vance, who had taught them that the world belonged to whoever was willing to stop pretending it didn't. Vance was 45 and looked, in the careful way of a man who paid people to keep him looking it, 10 years younger. He had a runner's leanness and a tailor on Davies Avenue, and a habit of holding eye contact a half-second past comfort, just to see who would look away first. He had grown up with money and turned it into more money, and somewhere along the way he had decided that this proved something about the shape of his soul. He believed in winners, and he believed in the people who were there to be won against, and he had never seriously entertained the possibility that the line between the two might not run exactly where he'd drawn it. The woman with the water tray was named Cora Whitmore, and she was 28 years old, and she had been on her feet since 4 o'clock that afternoon. Nobody in the Halcyon Room knew anything about her, which was the entire point of being a server at a place like the Carlisle. You were meant to be a pair of hands and an absence. You refilled the glass and cleared the plate, and you did it without ever once making them aware that a person was doing it. Cora had gotten good at the absence. She had a face she put on for these rooms, pleasant and a little vacant, and she kept her eyes down and her opinions further down than that, and at the end of the night she took the streetcar east, and then the bus, and she let herself into the small apartment in Leslieville, where her mother sat by the window, not always remembering what year it was. Her mother's name was Silsey, and 3 years ago she had been a high school music teacher with a loud laugh and a garden, and now she had a diagnosis that the doctors said, in the gentle, careful voices they used for things that did not get better. The hospital part of it, The part everyone assumed was the hard part, was covered. That was the thing people from away never understood about getting sick in this country. It was the rest that broke you. The care worker who came mornings so Cora could work. The medications the plan didn't cover. The renovations to the bathroom. The income her mother no longer earned, and the income Cora couldn't earn because someone had to be home the other half of the day. The arithmetic of it was simple and merciless, and Cora ran it in her head most nights instead of sleeping. They were 4 months behind on the little house in Hamilton that her mother refused to sell because it was the last thing of her own she had left. So Cora carried water, and before all of this, before the diagnosis and the form letters from the long-term care facilities and the long bus rides, she had been someone else entirely. But that was a door she kept shut, because there was no use to opening it. Vance had stood up from the table by then and walked to the chess set in the corner, a heavy thing of ebony and boxwood on a marble-topped table that the hotel kept for show. He picked up the white queen and turned it in his fingers. "I want to make this evening memorable," he announced, and the room turned toward him the way iron filings turn toward a magnet. "We've all had a wonderful day. Generational, really, and I'm feeling generous." He set the queen back on its square with a small, precise click. "I learned this game at 6. My grandfather, who was a serious man, used to say that chess is the only honest test there is. No luck, no referee, no committee." He let his eyes travel the room, and there was something underneath the smile now, something hungry. Just 2 minds, and the truth about which one is stronger. He reached into his jacket and brought out his checkbook and a pen that probably cost more than Cora made in a week. $100,000, he said, writing as he spoke. "To anyone in this room who can sit across from me and win. Anyone at all." He tore the check free and laid it on the baize. "Surely," he said, smiling wider, "in a room this full of winners, somebody fancies their chances." The executive laughed and looked at their drinks. They knew exactly how unwise it would be to take Roman Vance up on anything, least of all the one thing he'd just spent 20 minutes proving he could do. "Come on," Vance said, and the playfulness in it had teeth. 40 people. Are we really going to tell me that every single one of you knows you'd lose? Because that's interesting. That tells me something about who I've hired." His gaze swept the room and snagged, the way these things do, on the staff lined up against the wall by the service door. He looked at them for exactly long enough that everyone understood he had looked. Cora was perhaps 3 meters away with a fresh tray of water glasses, doing what she always did, which was nothing, when a young associate named Colby, 3 scotches in and trying to back out of his boss's eyeline, stepped square into her shoulder. The tray went. She grabbed for it and caught most of it, but 2 of the heavy crystal tumblers slid off the lip and met the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot in a library. Every head turned. Cora's face went hot. She was on her knees before she'd decided to be, gathering the long curved shards, her hands moving fast and careful, and for one terrible second the whole celebration had a single object, and it was her. "Well," Vance's voice came down to her, warm and slow and pleased. He crossed the room without hurry and stopped close enough that she could see her own kneeling reflection in the mirror shine of his shoes. "It seems we have a volunteer after all." A few of the men laughed. The laughter was nervous, but it was laughter. "I'm so sorry, sir," Cora said, eyes on the floor, on the glass, on anything else. "It was an accident. I'll have it cleaned up right away." "Look at you," Vance said, and he said it gently, which was worse. "Can't even carry the water. This is the whole thing, isn't it? This is what I keep trying to explain to people who think the world is supposed to be fair." He turned to play it to the room. "Some of us are built to do the difficult thing, and some of us are built to clear the difficult things table afterward. There's no shame in it. There's only confusion when somebody forgets which one they are. The maitre d', a careful man named Aldridge, who had spent 22 years learning exactly how much of this to absorb, came out from the wall fast. "Mr. Vance, I'm terribly sorry." His voice had the smoothness of long practice and the tremor of real fear underneath it. "She'll be sent home for the evening. Please accept our apologies. It won't happen again." Sent home for the evening. Cora stopped picking up the glass. She did the arithmetic, because she always did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said, sent home meant the rest of the shift unpaid, and the rest of the shift unpaid meant she would be short again this month. And short again this month meant another call to the care facility asking for more time, another conversation with the man at the bank who had stopped pretending to be sorry. It meant her mother's house, the garden under the snow, the last thing that was hers, and something that had been packed down very tightly for 3 years under the water trays and the pleasant vacant face and the long bus rides came loose all at once. She stood up. She didn't look at Aldridge. She wiped her palms on her apron, slow, deliberate, and she looked straight into Roman Vance's face, a thing a server is never, ever supposed to do, and she said, "I'll take the bet." For a moment the room didn't understand it. Vance certainly didn't. His expression flickered, an actual crack in the surface, before it sealed over into delight. The $100,000! Her voice was steadier now, which surprised her as much as anyone. "You said anyone in the room. I'm in the room." The murmur went around like wind through wheat. Several of the men had their phones out already. The glow of recording screens lit their faces, and the faces were thrilled, because this was so much better than a celebration. This was a spectacle. The billionaire and the bus girl. They could already see the clip. Cora. Aldridge had her by the elbow, his voice a furious whisper. "Apologize now. Go to the kitchen." She took her arm back. Not roughly, just completely. "He made the offer to the room," she said. "I'm part of the room." Vance laughed, a single sharp bark of it, genuinely amused. "She's serious." He spread his hand toward the marble table like a man inviting a guest to dinner. "By all means, but let's make it worth the air it'll cost. If you lose, and you understand that you are going to lose, you don't simply go back to the glasses. You stand in the middle of this room, in front of these people, and you say out loud that I was right, that some are built to do the difficult thing, and some are built to serve it. Say that when you lose." Cora didn't blink. "And when I win, the check is good in the morning." The men oohed. Somebody actually oohed. Vance gestured at the board with the open palm of a man who has already counted his money. "After you." She walked to the table. With every step the room seemed to fall away from her. The orchids, the gas fire, the smell of truffle oil and expensive cologne. What came up in its place was a basement on Roncesvalles, with bad fluorescent light and the smell of instant coffee and old paper, the click of cheap plastic pieces, and a heavy old man with nicotine-stained fingers leaning over her shoulder saying, in his thick, deliberate accent, "No, no, little one, do not look at the move you want to make. Look at the move he is praying you will not see." His name had been Bohdan Tarasenko, and he had been the closest thing to a grandfather she had ever had. She reached the table. She did not sit right away. Instead, she reached behind her back and undid the knot of her apron and let it slip off her shoulders and pool on the floor, and the small, deliberate ordinariness of the gesture made the room go quieter than any speech could have. She sat down on the white side, because Vance, of course, had not offered her a choice of color, and a man who needs to win does not give away the first move. He took white. He took the advantage. He sat across from her, with his sleeves rolled, relaxed, certain, a predator who had already eaten. "Whenever you're ready," he said. "I'll go easy. We'll keep it to 15 minutes aside. Wouldn't want you to be late for the rest of the dishes." Cora set the chess clock without comment. He opened the way she'd known he would, fast and aggressive, throwing pawns up the center, the chess of a man who had read about attacking play, and concluded that the point of the game was to make the other person afraid. For the first 10 moves, she did almost nothing of note. She developed quietly. She castled. She kept her position low and tight and unremarkable, and to the executives crowding behind their boss, it looked exactly like what they expected. The rich man pressing, the waitress hanging on. But Bowden had taught her that the loudest player in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. Vance attacked because he could not bear to wait. Every piece he threw forward was a piece that wasn't coming back. She let him come. She gave him a pawn he was thrilled to take, and never noticed had cost him the only square that mattered. She let him chase a threat across the board that had never really been a threat, just a shape she'd made to look like one, and while he chased it, his own king sat in a draft he hadn't felt yet. By the 20th move, something in the room had changed, though most of them couldn't have said what. The men who actually understood the game, there were 2 or 3, had stopped smiling. One of them set his drink down very carefully on a side table, as if a loud noise might break something. Vance felt it before he saw it. He was a man with good instincts about danger, which was most of how he'd gotten what he had, and the instinct was telling him that the floor was no longer where he'd left it. He leaned in. The ease went out of his shoulders. He started, for the first time that evening, to actually think, and the thinking came too late, because the position he was thinking about had been lost 8 moves ago, when he was still congratulating himself. Across the table, Cora wasn't gloating. She wasn't even fully there in the halcyon room anymore. Her hands moved over the pieces with the unhurried certainty of muscle and memory, and her mind ran 3 and 4 and 5 moves ahead, down branches that opened and closed like doors, and underneath all of it, very quietly, a part of her she had told to be silent for 3 years was singing. She slid her knight to a square that did nothing. That was the thing about it. It threatened nothing, attacked nothing, and Vance stared at it and could not for the life of him work out why it frightened him. Then his own pieces, all of them crowded forward in the attack he'd been so proud of, became a wall. His king sat behind his own pawns, with no heir, no exit, hemmed in by the very army he'd sent out to win. She lifted her queen and offered it, laid it down on a square where he could take it for free, where any sensible person would take it for free. He took it. There was nothing else to do that didn't lose faster, and her knight came down, the quiet knight, into the one gap his captured queen had opened, and there was no square on the board his king could move to, and no piece that could block, and no piece that could capture, and it was finished. Smothered mate. The oldest, most elegant little trap in the whole game. A king choked to death by his own defenders. Bowden had made her drill it until she dreamed it. She pressed the clock. She didn't say anything. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the polished surface of the marble table, and the silence that came down over the halcyon room was not the silence of before. The first one had been anticipation. This one had wait. This one was the silence of 40 people who had come to watch one thing and had seen, by accident, something else entirely, and did not yet know what to do with it. The clatter of a fork hitting a plate somewhere broke it. Then the murmur rose, fast and disbelieving, and the phones that had been raised to record a humiliation were recording something the people holding them could not have named. Vance had gone very still. The color had drained from beneath his careful tan, and his jaw worked, the muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked at the board as if he could make it lie. He looked at the check on the baize, and because Roman Vance had never in his life lost a thing he could not afterward refuse to admit he'd lost, he did what such men do. "A trick," he said, his voice had lost its boom. "A party trick. One game. Anybody can drill a single trap into their hands and spring it on an amateur who doesn't know it's coming." He stood up and the chair scraped. "One game proves you've got a good memory. It doesn't prove you can play." The room had quieted to watch. They all knew the terms. The terms had been his. "You played one game," Vance said, louder now, climbing back toward authority by sheer volume, against a man who was being generous. "If you want $100,000 of mine, you don't get to win it with a card trick." He pulled his phone out of his jacket and started swiping at it, hard, his thumb stabbing the glass. "You want me to believe you're a player? A real player solves what's put in front of them." He found what he was looking for. He turned the phone around and set it down on the marble beside the board, screen up. "Solve that. White to play and win. Right now. In front of everyone, if you can even read it." On the screen was a position Cora recognized before her eyes had finished crossing it. White had a king and a single pawn, one step from queening. Black had a king and a rook. To anyone glancing at it, it looked like the most ordinary thing in the world. White promotes the pawn, gets a queen, easy. Except the rook was placed, so that the instant White made a queen, Black would give check and then win the new queen by a skewer, and the game would collapse into a draw. It was a study composed in 1895, and it had fooled grandmasters, because the only way to win was to refuse the obvious, to promote not to a queen, but to a rook, the weaker piece, threatening a mate the queen could never threaten, and to win by giving up the very thing everyone reached for first. It was a cruel choice on Vance's part, and a stupid one, because he had looked it up in a panic and not understood that he was handing her the one kind of problem she had loved most as a child. The kind where the answer is to want less than your opponent expects you to want. Cora looked at the screen. Then she looked up at him. "You want me to solve the Saavedra," she said. "Off a phone." "What's the matter?" Vance said, and the sneer was back, brittle now, a thing held together with tape. "Can't see the board. Or are you finally ready to admit you're out of your depth?" "She doesn't need the phone." The voice came from the back of the room. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It carried the way certain voices carry, the way a cello carries under 100 violins, and every head turned toward it. A man rose slowly from the corner booth, leaning on a cane with a worn silver head. He was somewhere past 70, with a heavy stillness to him, and he wore a plain charcoal suit that had been good 20 years ago and was simply old now, in a room full of suits that screamed their newness. He had been there all evening, a guest nobody on the floor staff had quite been able to place, the sort of guest whose name got whispered and never confirmed. Vance's sneer faltered for the first time all night. "Mr. Kovac," he said, and there was a new note in it, the careful note of a man addressing the one person present he had wanted to impress. "We're only having a bit of fun." The old man ignored him completely. He crossed the floor with the slow tap of the cane marking time in the quiet, and he stopped a few feet from the table, and his eyes, pale, sharp, terribly kind, were fixed on Cora. He looked at her tired face, at the hair coming loose from its knot, at the apron crumpled on the marble at her feet. "So this is where you went," he said softly, and his voice cracked on it, just slightly. "We wondered. Bodan wondered, right up until the end. He kept your games, you know. He had them out on the table the week he died, going through them, the way an old man does." He shook his head slowly. "He always said you were the best he ever had, the one with the gift he couldn't teach, because nobody can teach it." A sound went through the room, a soft collective intake of breath, because some of them knew the name now. Emil Kovac, grandmaster, the strongest player this country had ever produced, twice a candidate for the world title, a man whose name was in the books their children read, if their children read those books at all. Vance had invited him as decoration, a piece of culture to put on the wall of the evening, hoping to charm him onto the board of some foundation that existed mostly to lower a tax bill. Cora's hands had begun to shake. Not from nerves, from the past arriving all at once, with no warning, into a room where she had spent 3 years making sure it could not find her. "My mother got sick, Mr. Kovac," she said, and her voice broke on the word mother the first time it had broken all night. "I had to leave. There wasn't anyone else." Kovac nodded, slowly, and in the nod was a whole understanding, the kind that doesn't need the details filled in. Then he turned, at last, to Roman Vance, and when he spoke, his voice had gone cold and clean as the air off the lake. "You asked her to solve the Saavedra position," he said. "Let me tell you what you have done. 6 years ago, I was a judge at the National Under-18 Championship. The youngest competitor in the field that year was a girl of 15 from a basement club on Roncesvalles, with no money and no sponsors and a coach who drove her to tournaments in a car that barely started in winter. She won every game, not drew, won. In the final round, she reached a position so difficult that 2 grandmasters in the analysis room could not agree on the result, and she found the win at the board, alone, with the clock running down, and when she played it, the whole analysis room stood up. He let that sit. Bohdan Tarasenko trained her for nothing, because he said it would be a sin to take money for it. He believed she would be the first woman from this country to earn the grandmaster title. He may still be right. The color had gone entirely out of Vance's face. He had the expression of a man who has stepped off a ledge in the dark and is still, in the half-second before the fall, hoping he was wrong about the ledge. "And your game tonight," Kovac went on, turning the cold of it fully on him now, his voice rising just enough to reach every corner of the room. "I watched it from that booth. Your attack was a child throwing furniture. You had no plan past move 6. You walked your own king into a coffin and called it aggression. You did not lose to a trick, Mr. Vance. You lost to someone who understood the game on a level you will not reach if you live to be 100. She did not merely beat you. She let you beat yourself, slowly, and was kind enough to make it look like a contest." The silence in the halcyon room was total now. Nobody dared to be the one who moved. Kovac lifted his cane and pointed it, without unsteadiness, at the check lying on the green baize. "Pay her," he said, "before I make a phone call. I still know 1 or 2 people at the Globe, and the Star, and I would dearly love to tell them about the developer who fancies himself a patron of culture and could not tell a queen sacrifice from a car accident." Roman Vance stood trapped in the middle of the room he owned, in front of the men he paid, stripped down to the truth of himself in under an hour. His hand shook, actually shook, as he reached for the pen he'd left lying on the marble. He bent and signed his name at the bottom of the check, the loops of it ragged, nothing like the careless flourish of an hour before. He did not hand it to her. He could not make himself do that. He slid it across the polished stone with one finger and looked at the floor. Cora picked it up. $100,000. She felt the weight of it the way you feel the weight of a thing you have stopped letting yourself imagine. It was the 4 months of arrears on the little house in Hamilton with the garden under the snow. It was the care worker for a year, and then another year. It was the medication the plan wouldn't cover, and the bathroom that needed redoing, and the breathing room, the simple, unbearable luxury of being able to breathe. It was her mother getting to stay her mother in her own home for as long as the disease would let her, instead of in a beige room in a building that smelled of other people's last years. She stood. She did not smile, and she did not gloat, and she did not say the cruel, clever thing she had every right to say. She looked down at the man staring at his own shoes, and she found that she felt, of all the things, a little sorry for him in the cold, remote way you feel sorry for weather. "My coach used to tell me something," she said quietly, and her voice was even now, gentle even. "He said the board doesn't care who your grandfather was. It doesn't care what you're worth or what you wear. You sit down, and it asks you one question, and the question is always the same. What can you actually see?" She paused. "You should sit down with it sometime, Mr. Vance, properly, when no one's watching. You might be surprised what's there." She bent and picked her apron up off the marble. She folded it, slowly, into a neat square, the way she folded the linen at the end of every shift, and she set it down on the closed lid of the chess table beside the abandoned checkbook and the silenced phone. Then she walked, past the frozen executives, past Aldridge with his ruined careful smile, past Emil Kovac, who reached out as she passed and pressed something into her hand, a card with a number on it, and the words "Call me." There is still time in an old man's careful script. She pushed open the double doors of the halcyon room and walked out into the bright, ordinary hum of the hotel corridor, and behind her, the wealthiest men in the city stood in a silence none of them would ever quite manage to explain. And outside the long windows the wind came off the lake and rattled the old glass, and the cold city went on glittering below, indifferent, the way it always had, to who was inside getting warm.